But that variety of different economies sometimes has problems on its tracks to functioning in the right way. And as any other economies do, command economies have their own weaknesses. Like what? This system is unresponsive to the needs and whims of consumers and to sudden change in conditions. For example, crop failure or fluctuations in the world price of raw materials. In the former USSR, state planners decided what was to be produced. They passed orders down to factories, allocating raw material, workers, and other factors of production to them. Factories were then told how much they should produce with these resources, and they should be sent. If there was shortage of goods in the shops, then goods would be rationed through queuing.
What are some other examples of those systems? In theory, the time and money spent on advertising and marketing in a free market economy can, in a communist economy, instead be devoted to producing something useful. However, historical experience in the 20th century suggests that planned economies had not produced the high growth as free market or mixed economies.
In practice, most economies tend to be mixed, combining free market policies with some state intervention.
We have invited a special guest to help explain the roles of social, political, and economic institutions found in communist and post-communist countries. Well, thank you. We know that post-communist countries have faced and are still facing challenges to build new political, social, and economical institutions to try and create a balance between equality and freedom. So far, not one country has been able to make such a dramatic change in all three of these areas at once. One of the basic steps in this process of changing from communism to a democratic regime is to identify the state in terms of its political independence and capacity. The party state under communism dominated basically all aspects of human relations. Under communism, a state's political independence and capacity were awfully high. When communism collapsed, the party who had leading role or no longer had all the power, and new leaders had to change that role. Reducing the state power was challenging. Lots of post-communist countries therefore wanted to narrow their state's political independence and capacity without making them useless. This wasn't an easy task. So, one of the first steps a communist country had to go through to become a democratic regime was to lower their state's political independence and capacity, which wasn't easy because this was a completely different way of handling things. That's correct. Now, another important step towards a democratic regime is establishing the rule of law. Under communism, the rule of law was very weak. Communist parties changed, broke, and made laws as they wished. As a result of that, people came to see laws as something rather cynical. This led to corruption and problems as soon as the power of the state was narrowed down. Laws and regulations are important in political life. They are the basic rules of the game, and that normally most people would obey because it's in their best interest. Now, the new people in power must be faithful to the legal structure and regulations, not acting in unpredictable manners or taking advantage of their position. Authoritarianism had been normal in many post-communist countries, and because of that, it was hard to create a democratic regime in these countries. To establish civil rights, to create a separation of branches in the government, to generate laws and regulate political parties, the constitution had to be rewritten. With all of these reforms going on, there were still many decisions to be made as to their final shape and form.
Would these countries follow the European parliamentary model or follow the presidential system?
East European post-communist countries tended to use the prime ministerial system. Countries from the former Soviet Union tended to use a semi-presidential or purely presidential system. Like Ukraine, for example, has a semi-presidential system. Another decision that had to be made concerned electoral rules. Would these post-communist countries have proportional representation or single-membering districts? Several post-communist countries mixed the two, but others used majority of proportional representation. And now, the last area of concern is civil rights. Constitutions under communism typically established a complicated set of civil liberties, but generally, these were ignored by those in power. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the authorities were supposed to decide how civil liberties should be constitutionally protected. This meant that the rule of law needed to be strengthened, and the decision needed to be made of what kind of rights that should be put in the Constitution and who would be in charge of enforcing them. Most of these countries had problems with their judiciary system, and so this became a problem as well.
Could you please describe for us the political institutions in transition?
Well, it has been 15 years since the fall of communism in East Europe and the Soviet Union. Ukraine is a post-communist country that broke away from the former Soviet Union. In Ukraine, democracy is illiberal and weakly institutionalized or just completely absent. Democratic rights and freedom are still restricted. Civil society is weak, and those in power have frequently enriched themselves through corrupt practices. For example, the stealing of money in Ukraine. Many people in Ukraine are very poor. Elderly people can barely live off of their pension because their pension is so low. There have been some good signs of hope for Ukraine, though, like for getting rid of the entrenched leaders such as Kuchma.
We know that in order to reestablish separation between the state and the economy, two processes are involved: marketization and privatization. Could you please tell us some more about these two terms?
Well, marketization is the recreation of market forces of supply and demand, and privatization is the transfer of state-held properties into private hands. So, with the process of privatization, small businesses were sold directly to their employees. In most post-communist countries, businesses were overstaffed, outdated, and unable to turn a profit in a market economy. Large industrial firms like coal mines were uncompetitive in the international market and were sold or drastically downsized, leading to lots of unemployment. Basically, in many countries, privatization caused social unrest because of the widespread unemployment. Then, marketization appears to be easier than privatization, but in fact, it's not such an easy process of just eliminating central planning and allowing markets to resurface naturally. There have been a lot of arguments about how fast the process of marketization should go. Some say that a gradual process would minimize social disruptions. Others say that the policy of shock therapy would work better. Shock therapy is when a quick process brings an end to the state subsidized for businesses almost overnight and brings an end to central planning.
What social institutions are in transition?
Religion used to be suppressed under communism, but now new religions and national identities have appeared in post-communist countries. The people living in these post-communist countries have to find collective and individual identities. People's lives drastically changed. Many of these big transitions in religious, ethnic, and national identities also generated division and conflict.
In addition to transforming the state and the regime, transitions from communism have also confronted the task of reestablishing some separation between the state and the economy. This involves two processes: marketization, or the recreation of market forces of supply and demand, and privatization, the transfer of state-held property into the private hands. The transition from communism to capitalism requires a redefinition of property.
Among the many questions and concerns facing the post-communist countries was how to place a price on the various elements of the economy: factories, shops, land, and apartments. What should the state do to privatize these assets?
To privatize these assets, the state should ask questions like who should get these assets and whether they should be given away, be sold to the greatest bidder, or made available to foreign investors. The process of privatization also was developed from some significant points.
Privatization was eventually carried out in a number of different ways, depending on the country and the kind of economic assets. In many cases, small businesses were sold directly to their employees. Some countries did sell many large businesses to the highest bidder, often to foreign investors. Other countries essentially distributed shares and firms to the public as a whole.
But in some countries, due to problematic large industrial firms that were uncompetitive in the international market, privatization proceeded slowly for fear of widespread unemployment and resulting social unrest.
In addition to recreating private property, states must recreate a market in which property, labor, goods, and service can all function in a competitive environment to determine their value.
In selecting particular forms of privatization or marketization, post-communist countries adopted new political economic models, some gravitating towards the social democratic models of Western Europe. Others are liberalism of the United States and United Kingdom, while still others opted for more mercantilist policies.
Ukraine is nowhere near having a democracy as stable and organized as other European countries. However, it's on its way. In 2005, it began its relationship with the EU, and they are now close trading partners. The EU and Ukraine trade reached over 34 billion euros and is steadily growing. Only recently, the Ukrainian president, Mr. Yushchenko, paid a visit to Brussels in hopes of strengthening those ties. Let's take a look at this interview.